It looks like we have a critical mass, so I am going to turn it over to Barbara Heritage.
Thanks so much, Erin, and hello, everybody. Pleased to have you here today. My name is Barbara Heritage. I'm the chair of the New Scholars Program Committee, and we're really delighted to be able to have you tuning in so that you can hear more about our program, our application process, and meet some of the people who've gotten New Scholars Awards in the past. I'm going to start off by introducing our committee, as well as the panelists who have joined us today. Cynthia Gibson is the vice chair of our selection committee, and she is the proprietor of bookfairs.com. Megan Constantino is the librarian at the Grolier Club in New York City. Jim Green, appearing here as James Green, is the librarian of the Library Company of Philadelphia. And Alex Hidalgo is associate professor at Texas Christian University, and we're just delighted to have them with us today. You'll be hearing from them more perhaps during the Q&A, depending on your questions. In addition, I want to welcome our panelists, Simran Thadani, who is going to be talking about her process. She gave the paper in 2017 for the Better Attaining to Fair Writing, the first printed dispute between English penmen, London, 1591. Matt Wills, who was a new scholar in 2020 and who produced the paper Crisis and the Scramble for Stability in Mao-era Publishing. Tess Goodman, a 2018 new scholar who worked on Copyright and Christmas, Victorian Publishing Strategies for the Poems of Walter Scott. And Megan Piorko, our 2019 new scholar, who worked on 17th century chemical collections, a study of unique copies of Fasciculus Chemicus. We are just, again, very pleased to have them here today as they can really tell you in detail about their process for applying to and presenting at the New Scholars Program. Okay, I'm turning it over now to the overview of our purpose of the program. So just to give you a sense of what we do with the New Scholars Program is we welcome, as you'll see in the slide, we welcome scholarship pursuing bibliographical approaches that embrace diverse multicultural perspectives. And the program has been pursuing that more and more in recent years. We also particularly encourage applications from those who have not yet previously published, lectured, or taught on bibliographical subjects. So if you're particularly new to bibliography and you've been doing research, this program is probably a great fit for you. And this year, we are welcoming joint applications, and we have requirements that are listed on our website. As you'll see on the slide, we do request a single abstract and cover letter, but then ask members of the joint application to submit individual CVs and recommendation letters. So the awards for joint applicants are divided among those applicants. All right, and now I'm kicking it over to Cynthia Gibson, our vice chair.
Thanks, Barbara. And let's see. So yes, hi everybody. I'm going to be speaking briefly about what we hope to achieve during this info session. First up, we want to help applicants to understand in a general way what the members of the committee consider to be a strong and compelling proposal. Second, we want to allow you to hear directly from previous new scholars about their experiences, especially with regards to their research, the proposal that they submitted for the fellowship, the presentation that they gave at the annual meeting, the paper that they ultimately submitted for peer review to the BSA's quarterly journal, the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, and also how that paper differed from the presentation they gave at the annual meeting. And finally, their overall experience of having been awarded a New Scholars Fellowship. And now I'm going to hand back to Barbara to discuss the attributes of a strong proposal.
Great. Thanks, Cynthia. So a strong proposal. So a strong proposal, as we've been evaluating them for the committee, really feature certain different points. First, a strong proposal puts forward an original and persuasive argument that engages with bibliography, broadly conceived, in meaningful and compelling ways. And you're going to hear a bit more about that from our panelists so you can get a better idea of what we're talking about. A strong proposal also draws on carefully researched and clearly delineated body of textual artifacts and or bibliographical sources and data. And again, our panelists have done work on that and will be speaking to their research methods. And there will be an opportunity to ask more about that as part of the Q&A. In addition, a strong scholarly proposal displays analysis and command of those materials. So that's something to keep in mind. And you'll want to, again, bring in other relevant work from the relevant disciplines you're working in, and also from bibliographical scholarship. And finally, your paper will describe the focus of a 15-minute presentation for an engaging presentation at BSA's annual meeting. This is a really important aspect because our membership is very diverse and not all of the members are scholars per se or academics or booksellers. They're a very broad membership. So you'll want to pitch it to people who have a general interest in bibliography and who might not really know about your field of expertise. And last but not least, provides an abstract for your longer proposed scholarly paper suitable for publication in the papers of the Society of, for BSA, sorry, and for peer review. All right, I'm kicking it back over to Cynthia Gibson.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Barbara. I'm going to direct my very first question to Sim. And Sim, I would like you to speak about the hands-on research you conducted with textual artifacts that formed the basis of your paper, and also to tell us a bit about the kind of bibliographical evidence that you gathered.
Thanks, Cynthia. Just as a refresher, my paper was about a dispute between two London writing masters or penmen in 1591. This was a very, very specific set of artifacts. In other words, just really two books that I was comparing. One, and they each exist in just one copy, both at the Huntington Library in California. I spent a week at the Huntington in 2012 and was doing a bunch of research and came upon these two books and recognized the connection between them really without having intended to dive deep into this. But once I found that connection, I realized that this could actually be the basis of a whole chapter of my dissertation that I was working on at the time. Each of these books was really just a pamphlet, maybe 30, 40 pages. So there wasn't a lot of in-depth research to do, if you know what I mean, and that, you know, there was one copy of one book each and they were both very short. But there was a lot of obviously interesting stuff to say about them. And what ended up happening and what the basis of my paper became was really the dialogue between the two texts and the two books that were published within really weeks of maybe months of each other. I also obviously went down other rabbit holes and compared to other contemporary texts, talked about the tradition to which these texts belonged, ended up looking at a lot of other auxiliary sources, but really the primary sources were just these two pamphlets. And then, you know, in the paper, remembering that it was a 15-minute presentation at BSA, which would then turn into a longer peer-reviewed article, remembering that this was a 15-minute oral presentation, I really tried to dive deep into the specifics of the specifics of the specifics, you know, really, really not ignoring the detail, remembering that people who were hearing this talk, or maybe even down the road reading the paper, the article, that these weren't people who were necessarily going to be familiar with the authors that I was considering, with the material that I was considering, with the dialogue between them, with the letters that they were transcribing. Remember, these were penmen, so they were teaching people how to write secretary hand, and remembering that maybe people can't read secretary hand. So I think what I did in terms of research was really trying to create a story around these two authors and the two books that they published. And then actually also to translate that into a broader tradition within which they fit, and then into things that, you know, language that people today could really understand and really appreciate why the stakes of this discussion between the two penmen was even worth writing about. So in terms of bibliographical evidence, of course, there were these two pamphlets. I also looked at surrogates of, you know, the digitized versions, just to sort of see what had been lost in translation between the actual item and then a black and white photocopy of microfilm that you get on Evo. But then the bibliographical research really took me in a lot of different directions. I'm happy to answer more questions during the Q&A if folks are particularly interested, but I think that hopefully sets up a good enough basis to understand what my paper was about. I will say also that my paper and then the article, the presentation, the article that came from it are not necessarily the only way to write a good new scholars paper. So I also am, you know, excited to hear from the other new scholars who can speak to the kind of work that they surveyed as well. Because I don't mean to suggest that mine was, you know, the only way to do bibliographical research and collect evidence. There's, you know, a wide variety of papers that have seen the light through BSA that deal with all kinds of different ways of cutting the historical record.
Great, thank you for that. My next question is going to be for Matt. Matt, are you with us?
I am here, yes.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so for you, I want to ask about the proposal that you submitted to the New Scholars Program. How did you marshal your bibliographical evidence to make it compelling to the committee? And in particular, how did you frame your argument for the proposal in order to reach an audience interested in bibliography?
Well, hello everybody, great to be here. So briefly put, my paper, I study propaganda publishing in modern China, and the paper I proposed was to do with the state's reliance on the supply of raw paper for publishing. When I wrote my proposal, I a little bit agonized because my dissertation, which I'm still writing now, is much broader. And I took the strategy of choosing one small part of it and creating a kind of focused topic. So that's a little bit similar to what Simran was just saying in terms of how there's something about providing like detail and getting into a case study that I think fits this kind of program. So I chose just this paper supply part. And in the proposal I wrote, I went into a good amount of detail. I didn't get like lost in the weeds, but I was introducing the publishers I was studying. I was trying to situate people within, or the people reading within, the kind of getting them absorbed a little bit into the case study. So I wasn't shying away from that kind of detail, because I think that's the kind of thing that a audience of bibliographers and people interested in that are enthusiastic for. In terms of marshalling evidence, I did the classic kind of grant application thing of trying to link this to as many concepts or find many angles as possible on this. So I was looking at paper supply, and I talked about it in terms of like regional variations within China in the power of the state to supply these materials. I talked about bureaucracy and inter-bureaucratic stresses. I talked about how my research also made a methodological contribution to the study of the modern book. So I have these kind of multiple angles to try and link my evidence to as many people as possible. When I was thinking about the audience and thinking about how the really is a mixed bag of people in terms of backgrounds in the audience at BSA, I really try to go for the broadest appeal of my work. So although I'm really a historian of China, I was linking I linked my research much more to industrial printing and industrial paper production, the history of modern paperback publishing, new avenues for studying propaganda in general. So I kind of toned down the regional studies part a little bit, which is what I'm more used to, and toned up the broader concepts. That was actually really useful because then I got a lot more feedback on that from people when I was presenting at BSA, and that actually became a much more important lens in my kind of final project anyway. So that was like worth doing. So yes, I framed it within recognizable fields of bibliography, like paper studies, industrial printing. And then in terms of creating a compelling proposal, I tried to shy away from that kind of like dry style that I think graduate students in particular often taught to write, in terms of being fairly boring. I tried some lively language, so I reread it this morning, and I had words like astonishing, a twisting tale, stressed, skyrocketing. And I did that very deliberately as I like tried to create a kind of compelling story that was actually fun to read rather than just strictly informative. So I would say people writing, you know, don't be afraid to embrace that kind of storytelling style if you if that's how you write. So I'd try and write it in a kind of authentic way as well. That's everything I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And yes, I will say that the committee members always like to believe that people won't fall asleep as they listen to these papers. So good call. My next question is going to go to Tess. And let's see. Tess, turning to the talk you gave at the annual meeting itself, what kind of work went into creating your presentation, and how did you pitch your argument and present your evidence to make a persuasive case to BSA's membership?
I think a lot of what I'm about to say is going to echo some of the things that Simran and Matt already said, but basically I'm going to say my basic advice is remember that the presentation is not the same as the final article. Focus on the material and the evidence, take advantage of your audience, and enjoy it, because I think the talk is the most fun part. So here's what I did. My research, my project focused on two groups of illustrated editions of Walter Scott's poetry that were produced in the mid-19th century. And I talked about how these two groups of editions were corner pieces of a larger publishing strategy that the publishers were trying to manage. When I was working on this, and I argued that the physical objects that were produced were developed from decisions about finances and marketing. When I was working on this project, I had never written an article before, but I'd given presentations, and it took me aback how different the two projects were. The talk is going to be a lot shorter than the final article is. So my advice is focus on the stuff. When I got ready to write my presentation, I sat down and I looked at this archive that I was working with, which I had already looked into as part of my dissertation research, but it had been sort of tangential. It had been a little cul-de-sac, and I took the time now to make sure I knew exactly what was going on with all the bibliography. I made sure I had all my facts straight. I made sure, you know, if this is, I think, looking at the book, I think this is a new edition. I go back to the archive and what did they say? Yes, they paid for new typesetting. In the archive, they say they're reselling something, going back to the books. Yes, this has new inserted leaves, but it's the same setting of type. So really, I sat down and made sure I knew exactly what was going on. And then, as Matt just said, I turned it into a story. I figured out how this fit into a broader context, and I looked at it as a narrative, so that my talk was not actually in the end about these two groups of books, but about the publishers who were making them and who were struggling, who had made a huge investment and who were struggling to figure out ways to recoup it. The evidence that I had been looking at, this publisher's archive, had this sort of tension in it about trying to figure out how to get their money back on this investment and make it profitable. And it was really tense and exciting research because the archives were kind of panicked. So I took that drama and I brought it into the paper and I told this story. And so whenever you're doing research, it's important to make sure that everybody understands what the stakes of the research are. It's important to say, you know, so what? Why does this matter? Why are we looking into this? Why am I listening to you talk about these publishers? And it's important to address those questions in the talk, but I also think it's important not to go into too much detail about them. I think it's better to focus on the evidence and enlarge upon your conclusions in the article where you have time. In the talk, my talk, writing it, felt very minimal to me. I told my story, I went through it briskly, without skipping any logical steps, but focusing on the evidence. I indicated the conclusions that I was going to draw in the article, but I didn't expand on them at length. So that is my advice. Your talk is going to be a summary of a portion. It's not going to be the whole thing. Make the stakes of your research clear, but start with your evidence and start with the stuff for a couple of reasons. For one thing, you want to make sure that the conclusions you are drawing are justified by what you're saying. You want to show your evidence. But you also have a wonderful audience of people, some of whom will know what you're talking about, some of whom won't necessarily have any experience with your work, but who are extremely knowledgeable, either who do this sort of analysis for a living or who are extremely enthusiastic about it as amateurs. And they can ask questions that will lead you in new directions, things you haven't anticipated. So it's really good to be able to bring your evidence to a group this kind and say, here's what I have, here's what I think it means and can lead to. What can you talk to me about it? What questions do you have? It can be a really productive opportunity. So yeah, if you have a minimalist but substantive bibliographical argument for a 20-minute talk that you're having fun with, then you're going to have enough material for a good article afterwards. And enjoy it, because it's a great opportunity to talk to people about your work with people who really will get excited with you. It's fun.
That was great, Tess. Thank you. The next question is going to go to Megan. And Megan, I'd like to ask you about the paper you submitted to PBSA. Can you talk about the process of preparing your research for an article that would be peer-reviewed and what the peer review process itself was like? And can you also speak to how the article you prepared for PBSA differed from the presentation that you gave at the annual meeting, as Tess was just discussing?
Sure, thanks so much, Cynthia. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly comment on what the other three speakers have mentioned, which is that like the audience for your presentation isn't going to be an expert in your topic, but what they are going to be an expert in is bibliographical scholarship. So I think you should definitely use that to your advantage, which is something I incorporated in the shift from my presentation to the article. I got a lot of really great feedback after my presentation, and I definitely incorporated some of those comments and a couple corrections I was really glad to have into my article. And I think it helped make my article strong as far as when it went through the peer review process. It probably needed less comments than if I had submitted it without having done the presentation first. So for preparing my research and turning what was a presentation into an article, because it definitely had that trajectory for me. I didn't have the full essay written yet. I wrote it as a presentation first. I kept in mind that I wanted to also simultaneously be writing a dissertation chapter, because I was in that stage of my PhD at that time, and time is very precious when you're trying to finish your dissertation. So that helped me sort of see it in the grand scheme of my larger dissertation project as well. And then a lot of what it was for me was my project, just a quick synopsis of it, is about the materiality of text and copy-specific evidence. So it's less about what is written in the books and more about how they were produced, and books is like a vessel for sharing knowledge. And I tend to use a lot of images in presentations because of that, to show the materiality of the text. And when I conceptualized a PowerPoint presentation, I had a lot of charts to show like what I meant by how the physicality of the text changed over time in the 17th century. So part of turning that into an article was making what was a PowerPoint slide into a chart that could be published in the papers of the Bibliographical Society of America. So sort of switching from a visual way of communicating what I'm trying to say to a written with some visual aids as like supporting the writing instead of the other way around. And so those are some of the differences between the article and the presentation. And then as far as the peer review process goes, it was really easy. It was very hands-on. The editorial manager software was easy to use, self-explanatory. And I mostly worked with David Gantz as far as the peer review process, and he was very, very helpful. He walked me through it. And I think that this is important for someone who is publishing their first article and is an early career scholar. So I really appreciated having this opportunity at that point in my career. And I also felt like I had full intellectual control over what was being published once it was accepted. I didn't, like, there were some suggestions, but they only worked to improve my article. So I really appreciated the opportunity, and I definitely think that it's helped me in my career a lot.
Great, thank you for that. And so finally, throwing the last question out to the entire panel, can you talk a little bit about how the New Scholars Program has influenced your ongoing bibliographical research and bookish pursuits more generally? Let's see. Shall we go in reverse order of new scholarliness? Matt, you want to speak first?
With pleasure. So I think that the experience of presenting a BSA has further pushed me, I would say encouraged me or given me the confidence to pursue that kind of bibliographical angle. As a historian, I felt a little bit like an imposter beforehand because I got a lot of encouragement and feedback, and I just submitted my PBSA manuscript, and I'm hoping that the review process, I'm sure, will also produce these kind of more food for thoughts. So it's really encouraged me to continue to develop that angle in my dissertation, and I now kind of firmly pitch my dissertation first as a kind of book history project rather than a Chinese studies project or a Chinese history project. So that's a great benefit. At the session, I also met up with several people who I've kept up correspondence with, and I think those links will pay dividends in the future. Thank you.
Great. Tess, oh no, sorry, Megan, would you like to give it a stab?
Sure, thanks. So yeah, I wanted to reiterate what Matt said about confidence. It made me more confident in my future proposals that I wrote about my skills as a bibliographer or in bibliographical, like using that as a methodology to explore the history of science, and also help me articulate like where I situate myself in the historiography, which is at the nexus of book history and history of science. And I recently received a postdoc from the Science History Institute that's an 80-20 postdoc, and the 20% of that is going to be working with the rare book curator there. So it definitely influenced my career trajectory in that way, and I'm really excited about that. Also think people recognize the Bibliographical Society of America, so I think it made me relevant in my applications and in the field.
Nice, great. Tess?
I think one of the most important effects of the BSA for me was to make me feel validated in taking a bibliographical methodology at a time when I felt unsupported in that, because I had done my master's at UVA and been surrounded by people, including Barbara, who were very, very enthusiastic and encouraging about taking a bibliographical approach and a book historical approach to scholarship. And then I went and did my PhD somewhere else that wasn't quite supportive. I don't think there was anybody in my department who would describe themselves as a bibliographer or say that they were doing bibliographical work. But I was trying to do that. And then I brought that research to the Bibliographical Society, and everybody around me said, yes, this is important, this is interesting, this is a valid way of doing scholarship and research. And that was really encouraging and really, really important, and helped me, stay in that track and continue the work that I was doing. So that was very valuable for me.
Great. Sim?
I guess I should preface this answer by saying that I am no longer in the field or even in academia. And so I'll be harking back a few years to talk about the impact that BSA had on my research and pursuits more generally. But I suppose it's worth first obviously starting to say, to echo Tess, that certainly the validation was huge, because this was an award that, if you look back at the lineage, you know, many of the people who've won this award have gone on to do really great things. And it was sort of an aspirational thing to sort of say, wow, like, you know, I won this award and I'm joining this, you know, this lineage. Going up to New York and the ability to have a conversation and make that presentation, to actually have a conversation with a wide range of people on the day of, and then subsequently was huge. And of course, the paper having been published, it's my only academic publication. I didn't even publish my dissertation. Has led to, you know, sometimes people will just randomly still reach out to me and say, I read your article, or, you know, I'm about to cite you, or things like that. So certainly that ability to get that platform to stand on and present my work was really, really encouraging for somebody who was in the throes at that point of writing her dissertation. Working on that peer review process, I will come out and just say it taught me I didn't really want to publish anymore. The process itself was very straightforward. Everybody was very respectful, but you know, I was much more interested in the oral exchange of ideas and the liveness of a presentation and the ability to make people laugh in the audience with telling a good story. And so in the coming years after that, I think I gave maybe another 10 or 12 talks, many of them based on this duel between the two penmen. That was the basis of this presentation. And it was always such an audience hit. And I think, you know, the ability to say, like, here's my way of doing this work or participating in this field was actually very validating. I don't know if that's relevant to anybody else who may be considering an alt-ac route, or you know, who wants to really dip their toes into academic publishing versus the go straight for the top method that many of us would maybe want as a default. But I think it's worth saying that as somebody who did this and then didn't pursue the traditional path, it was still extremely valuable for me, learned a lot of lessons about what I wanted out of my career. And then I guess the last thing to say is, well, two more things. One really quick, which is to say, I think honors beget honors. A couple of the other panelists have alluded to this as well, is that, you know, the BSA is a recognized name, and that seeing your CV, you know, get this line in it makes people sort of sit up and take notice of you. So, you know, I think that you sort of build up the awards, you know, so this was a really amazing, both a stepping stone and a culmination for me, because it was sort of late in my career. But then people would say, oh, you're a BSA New Scholar. And in fact, then that led into me becoming more involved with the BSA, in fact, by serving on the New Scholars Committee for the next 5 or 6 years, and then serving on the board of the council of the BSA. So there was, you know, maybe less of a traditional story for me to report, but I think it's still worth saying that having this exposure was very, very meaningful to me.
Great, thank you. And with that, I just want to say thank you to the panel. We're going to move on to Q&A. And let's see, Barbara will be moderating, and I will be reading the questions out of the Q&A. So I'm going to pass it back to Barbara.
Thanks, Cynthia. Great. So thanks again to the panelists for all of their thoughts, their feedback. And I think it's really great to have the range of observations that we heard for you to think about when you're preparing your application. Cynthia is going to be looking at your questions as they appear, and we'll be reading them aloud. And we will be sharing those questions with specific people as they come up. So I'll be putting those out to either our panelists, members of the committee, or to Erin Schreiner, depending on what you're asking. So Cynthia, do you want to start with the first question?
Sure. The first question comes from Mathieu. And it says, I have a very practical question about the application. Is the committee looking for a particular length for the application letter?
Great. And the short answer is that we have the application criteria outlined as part of the application form, which is in Kaleidoscope. Cynthia can fill us in specifically here because she's been the latest one to update Kaleidoscope, but I believe that we recommend that the application be contained within to up a few pages. Is that right, Cynthia?
Yes, I believe so. I'm not even sure that we specify.
But I would say that in general, you can create and draw up a very successful proposal within a couple of pages. The important thing is to be specific about your abstract and to, again, delineate, as you heard from these panelists, what your vision is for the presentation, as well as the paper that you plan to submit to PBSA. So I hope that that's helpful. I think it's important to remember that it is in a sense a letter, so we don't expect we don't expect you to go at length citing evidence in the letter itself. I hope that's helpful.
I have a question from Pranav, I believe. May I request the panelists to discuss what they believe constitutes the key disciplinary concerns of bibliography? That's probably a bigger question than we can completely answer today, but somebody want to give it a shot?
Jim, do you want to take that one? Jim Green, if you're still with us.
Hello, I'm still with you. I'm getting a lot of drag on the reception, so I've missed some of the discussion. But I think that the disciplinary interest, I don't know if this calls a disciplinary interest or not, but is that, sorry, I'm just my lighting here, that the Bibliographical Society of America and I think as a group sees the study of bibliography as focusing on materiality of texts. And though there are lots of different definitions of bibliography, I think that the emphasis on materiality is a really key one for the society, but also for these presentations.
Great, thanks, Jim.
Okay, let's see. Here's one from Malcolm. It says, it is clear that projects need to have a focus to make them feasible. I have a project in mind which is more methodological. How would I make a proposal that is less focused on specific material and more on approaches?
Interesting. That's a fantastic question. And I'm wondering if there's anyone among the panelists who wants to answer that.
Hey, that's a really interesting question. I would say, like, so I did that a little bit with like looking at copy specific evidence, like an emphasis on the approach that I was doing, but I also kept a theme in there. Like I still had my dissertation topic like in there somehow. Like I assume that's what you would be pulling from as well. So I think a combination of the two will be feasible, but I think strictly methodological might lose people in the details a little bit, but that's just my 2 cents.
Great.
I'd just like to add one quick thing about that. I think that especially if there are some new methodologies that have previously been underutilized, like for example, last year's panel was on bibliography and technologies. And if you're looking at, let's say, the use of analysis of mitochondrial DNA of materials, of, samples of stuff found on materials and how that has an impact on the way that we look at material texts, then I think that those kinds of conversations about method are definitely relevant and welcome.
Absolutely.
If
Thanks,
I may just hop in here to maybe also provide the perspective of someone who served on the committee and read applications, I think it was always helpful, even with methodological papers, to sort of say, you know, why am I taking this approach with this particular set of data or these particular items? Especially with new methodologies which may not be familiar or you know, have really found mainstream acceptance, you know, like GIS or, you know, something like that. Like it is essentially to remember, and I think every panelist said this, that you're really telling a story, and to try to explain not only to the committee, but then also to your broader audience, not just that I think we should do this way, but let me exhibit for you how I did this way, why it is the right methodology, and why I think and how I think it can be applied elsewhere. So really the responsibility of the burden of proof, I suppose to say, is on you to sort of validate your choice of method or your choice to focus on method over, you know, just going with a copy specific or text specific argument.
And I would add to that too, Sim, and thank you for that insight, which is really important to keep in mind. I would add that when you do go into those details, try to avoid jargon, because again, your readers on the selection committee are going to be from different, not only different disciplines, but different coming from different backgrounds completely. And the same for the audience of BSA. So you can, if you do use a term of art, or if you do refer to something very specific, do take the time very briefly to explain what that is in layman's terms, but for an educated audience. Cynthia, next question.
Yeah, a number of people are interested in this question. How many applications does BSA generally receive for these spots? And do you expect any significant changes to this resulting from COVID?
I can go ahead and take that. We usually receive somewhere between 16 to 25 applications, and that number, I think, very well could increase given the interest in the program that we've seen so far. I do think, because we are going to be holding the meeting virtually, that there is a little bit more accessibility this time around, and that might be helpful, as it were, in bringing people into the process that might not have been able to travel, for example, to New York in January. So that's my feeling, but I'd be interested in hearing anything else from the committee on that.
I'll just jump in and say that from what I've been seeing with engagement in our programs virtually, we are seeing a much broader amount of participation in a variety of ways. And this also relates to a question that was answered by text in the answered questions box of the Q&A about who typically attends and BSA membership. We have typically, so something important to know about the New Scholars Program and the BSA annual meeting is that it falls during Bibliography Week. Some of you might not know what Bibliography Week is. And that is a week in January where bibliophilic societies like at the American Printing History Association, the Bibliographical Society of America, the Grolier Club, and a few other organizations like the National Library of Medicine, or not the National Library of Medicine, the New York, yes. I'm not remembering correctly, but anyway, it doesn't matter, hold meetings, lectures, etc. So we don't have a formal conference in the BSA. We sort of participate in a variety of programming that is all based physically in New York City year after year after year. So what we see mostly is academics, librarians, booksellers, and also book collectors who are involved with these other organizations coming to our annual meeting. And most people are based in New York. Most people are not traveling in from elsewhere, although people certainly do travel in from elsewhere, especially library curators who are attending the book fair that traditionally takes place during Bibliography Week. So all that said, I have witnessed, as the person sort of behind the scenes running all of our online programming, a much larger representation of academics among the people attending our online programs. And I expect that to carry over into the annual meeting, especially because everything we do online is free and open to the public. As long as you register, you can attend. And I also expect that there will be more engagement because of COVID, because we are seeing more and more people signing up, participating, attending things, whether that's going to drive an increase in actual applications to the program. My gut feeling is yes, I think that this year the program is going to be more competitive. But, you know, the proof is in the pudding, so don't hold me to it.
Thanks, Erin. That's really, really helpful for people to know. And thank you too for describing the usual format that we've been holding these meetings in, and how this is different. So I hope that's helpful for the people who are tuning in. Cynthia, do you want to give us another question?
A good one. The BSA began with a clear interest in diverse approaches. We are coming from a specific cultural and disciplinary basis as Indigenous, Native American applicants. Is the BSA audience / selection committee open to learning about different methodological approaches? Oops, it just jumped. Hang on. To the field of the bibliography, which may even challenge the field itself?
Thanks for that question. And I'll just kick off a response by saying yes, absolutely. This is an area that's very important for us to understand, and bibliography historically has been very much focused on hand press period materials in America and Europe, and this is something that is changing, not only at BSA, but in other places like Rare Book School. And so the study of Indigenous materials and the different approaches that are required for that, the way that study might push bibliography to think about itself in a more reflective way is very, very important to BSA and to other bibliographical areas that are pursuing this. And I think the more that we can consider this, the better for the future of bibliography. I'm sure that other people in the selection committee feel this way. So I'll just but they might have other particular ideas about that. So I'll just open it up to the committee. Anyone else?
I'll just say that with respect to, and I know I'm not a member of the committee, but I am the leadership of the BSA alongside the council. And I think that just looking at that question again, that the specifically different methodological approaches when it comes to Indigenous and Native American objects are really, really important, and that we welcome those perspectives because it broadens our ideas of what, it gets at the heart of what we do, which is broadening ideas of what material texts can be and the kinds of questions that we want to ask about them. So that's another way of saying what Barbara said, but I think hopefully adds a little bit of nuance.
I'll just echo what both Barbara and Erin have said in terms of the scope of bibliographical work and the types of things that we expect to see as the field diversifies in terms of regional specialization and also methodological work. So I'm excited to read across a wide range of areas.
And I would like just to add that Alex, who was just speaking, does work on Indigenous materials in Latin America. So we have, we are recognizing this area and trying to build that expertise, not only as part of BSA, but also within our own committee. Cynthia, do you have another question for us?
I do. I have one directed specifically to Sim. It says, thank you for being so generous with your insight and experience. Great research. You mentioned bibliographical research provided for more avenues in research. How? What did you discover through taking this approach?
Good question. And as a confirmed generalist / dilettante, I think it's worth saying that I encourage it in other people as well. But let me know if I'm not quite answering the question, and I can try to go into a little bit more detail. This work ended up taking me from 2 London penmen, 2 very specific pamphlets, 1591, looking at the intersection between manuscript and print, because each of these books was sort of intended to be completed by hand. That's where it started. It then took me to thinking about authorship studies, because I was thinking about the way in which these 2 humans were interacting with each other. Readership studies, because I was thinking about how the books would have been received, how many copies there might have been, and then sort of more broad cultural history, the history of writing more generally, and how it was represented in print. All of these things sort of filtered their way into my dissertation, but this particular bit of research really became it. It could have been just a chapter about this very tight thing, but it wouldn't have been much of a chapter. And so I thought, how do I make this really fit within the broader context, right? And how do I tell these stories? And so I ended up dipping my toes into various other approaches and wrote a dissertation chapter that was essentially stitching together not only this story about William Pank and Peter Bales, but then also these digressions, I guess, or contextualizations to sort of bring in these other aspects of what was important to say to really give context to the story. And then the subsequent chapters of my dissertation, I thought, well, I don't want to just end up with like 2 authors and 2 texts, in each of them. So then it also gave me a sort of a counterpoint, if you will, to say, okay, this chapter was very, very deeply focused on, these particular texts, but I'm going to take a different approach in another chapter and talk about, the rise and fall of flourishing in calligraphy books, for instance, which is a whole other bibliographical, maybe even the wrong word. It's a different approach altogether to think about calligraphy, and how that influenced the printing world and so on. And so I then went into a whole manuscript studies angle of things, and I sort of tried to deliberately construct 5 different stories. The 5th chapter ended up being about the history of writing in Britain as it was documented in these texts that were sort of aggrandizing the history of writing. And the history of writing began in Britain. Britain was the first country to really achieve the pinnacle of penmanship and things like that. And so really studying the historical record and digging and poking holes in it and things like that. So I think there were a lot of different things that found their way into the dissertation, and I was okay with that, and my committee was okay with that, thank goodness. But it was then a way for me to sort of explore, right? And this particular piece of research, just to reiterate, served as, because it was such a neat crystallization of, you found this thing in the archive and you're like, oh my God, this is a chapter right there, that then you could take from that and say, do I want this to be the strain that runs through the whole, or do I want this to be one method that shows how I can work in this vein, and then use other chapters to try to do other things. So I'll stop there. I hope I've answered the question as that you intended.
Thanks,
That was
Sam.
great. Thanks. So we have another one directed specifically to Matthew, and this one says, thank you for your insight. You mentioned you're trained as an historian. How did you navigate bibliographical research and marry both history and book/print history?
Matt, you still with us? Great.
Yeah, in my department, there isn't a lot of book history happening. And so when I was first interested in this, I read a lot of scholarship on book history, most of it from Europe and America, because that's where book history is centered in bibliography. And after that, I got a little bit disheartened because I was like, people are not really talking about modern Chinese propaganda publishing, it seems to be more like Shakespeare First Folio stuff, right? So, and then I was talking to my advisor, and he was like, what you've got to do is you've got to prevent the compelling case for like why the definition of bibliography or book history or worthwhile book history can be expanded to any of those things, right? So somebody else asked about, can they include 20th or 21st century topics? Absolutely, because mine is very much a 20th century topic. And I thought about like, why does studying the production of millions and millions of copies of the same book offer something which we can't learn about by looking at hand-pressed books? And I think a lot of that for me was having the confidence to kind of own my research and say, yes, this stuff does matter, and here is why. And I presented reasons for that. And I would say the same to the person who asked about, say, studies of indigenous texts or field challenging work. I think that is really exciting. And if that's phrased in a way where like bibliography has to include this because of these like following reasons, I think that's to do it. So rather than making your research fit the definition of bibliography, make the field fit your research. I think that's how fields grow. So yeah, that's how I navigated that kind of process, but I'm still in the middle of navigating it, haven't arrived at the end point yet. Thank you.
Thanks so, Matt.
A question that was answered in writing, but I think it's a good one to maybe even wrap up on. It's at the moment I'm not in academia as either a student or a scholar. Would that affect eligibility for the award?
Cynthia, will you repeat that one more time?
Oh, sure. It just, I'm not in academia as either a student or as a scholar, or I would presume as an instructor. Would that affect eligibility for the award?
Independent work. People don't have to have an affiliation. You do have to have a letter of recommendation, but no, you don't need to necessarily be affiliated with an academic institution, and you can be coming from a different place. For example, you might be a collector and you have a different emphasis in terms of your day-to-day work, but you have insights from being a collector. That's fine, that's welcome. And so scholarship and insight comes from many different walks of life, and we recognize that. And so I would just, I would encourage you to apply if this, if what we've described interests you, and if you feel like you have a story to tell that you want to share with our community, we would welcome that.
There was also a follow-up question to that. Would an untenured scholar with lots of teaching/publishing experience but not in book history be eligible?
Yes, I mean, if you haven't been working in bibliography or book history per se, and you're new to bibliography and new to book history and these kinds of conversations that we've been talking about, certainly, please do apply.
Well, I think that's everything, and we are coming up at 3 o'clock on the nose here. So I want to extend my really heartfelt thanks to this committee and to our former new scholars who have spent their afternoon and quite a bit of time preparing for this presentation. So thank you all so much. Thank you all who have attended. I'm going to direct you, if you have any further questions about the New Scholars Program, to contact Barbara Heritage. Her email address is on the New Scholars page on our website. And if you have any general questions about BSA and any of our other programming, please do feel welcome to reach out to me by email anytime. You can find my email address on the contact page on the BSA website. So enjoy your afternoon, everyone, and we look forward to receiving your applications and a really good crop of new scholars this year. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.